Good evening, and thank you for slipping into Sleepy Kitchen with me. Tonight, we're settling in with bread, the kind you slice slowly on a wooden board while the crust gives a soft crackle under a serrated knife. A few crumbs drift down like little flakes. The loaf still a little warm at the center, and the air carries that toasted, lightly sweet smell that makes the whole room feel calmer. Bread lives in so many corners of daily life. Morning toast, a bowl of soup with something to catch the last spoonful, a baguette tucked under an arm on the way home. And yet it's never just background. It's a small, steady ritual, grain ground into flour, water given time to change, and heat turning something plain into something you can hold and share. One simple, wide-angle truth about bread is this: with flour, water, salt, and time, you can make hundreds of styles because tiny changes in grain, hydration, fermentation, and heat reshape the loaf completely. Rest where you are, let your shoulders soften, and take a slow breath in and out as you listen. Easy, unhurried, and calm. If this kind of cozy food storytelling helps you wind down, you're always welcome to subscribe and come back whenever you're in the mood for something gentle. Let's begin. Bread is one of the oldest prepared foods we can point to with real evidence. Archaeological finds suggest people were making flatbread-like foods from wild grains at least 14,000 years ago, before farming was fully established. That means the urge to grind, mix, and cook came before tidy rows of crops. Bread shows up in human history before fields and plows do, and even before ovens were common, because early breads could be cooked on hot stones, clay, or other simple heated surfaces. The shapes were simpler, but the idea was already there. Turn grain into something you can carry and share. At its simplest, bread can be just flour plus water, then heat. That trio is enough to make something you can pick up and eat, because flour is grain ground fine enough to drink in moisture, and water is what turns powder into a cohesive paste you can shape. Heat finishes the job by setting that paste so it holds together. Once you see bread as wetting, shaping, and setting, a lot of variety starts to feel less mysterious. Different breads may look worlds apart, but many of them are still solving the same small problem in different ways. Water is one of the biggest field decisions in bread, and small shifts can change the whole personality of dough. Use less water, and the dough tends to feel tight and sturdy, easier to handle, more likely to hold a neat form. Use more water, and it becomes softer and more open, often baking up with a lighter interior and larger air pockets. This is one reason bread can be fast or slow without becoming complicated. A thin flatbread can go from mixing to cooking in minutes, while a tall loaf can take hours because it waits on fermentation, shaping, and moisture loss, not because the ingredient list is complicated. Leavening is how you put gas into dough so it bakes up less dense, like making bubbles on purpose. One route is yeast, a living microbe that eats available sugars and releases carbon dioxide gradually, giving the dough time to expand and develop flavor. Another route is chemical leavening, where baking powder makes gas quickly once it's wet and heated, as in many biscuits and quick breads. More trapped gas usually means a lighter interior and a taller shape. Less gas points you toward flatter, tighter breads that are meant to stay sturdy, slice cleanly, or wrap without tearing. When you can name the leavener, you can often predict whether the dough needs a long rise, a short rest, or no waiting at all. Flour choice decides whether a dough can stretch to hold bubbles or tends to crack and stay compact. Wheat flour is common for lofty loaves because, when it meets water in mixing, its proteins can form gluten, an elastic network that behaves like a flexible net. Kneading, folding, and time help that network become smoother and stronger so it can trap gas without tearing. That's why bread flour tends to make chewier, taller loaves than cake flour, and why all-purpose flour often lands in the middle as a useful default. Whole grain flours can taste richer, but they may bake up denser because bran can interrupt that stretchy web. A lot of breads balance flavor and structure by blending wheat with other grains. A common myth is that bread only rises when someone adds commercial yeast, when natural fermentation can start on its own. Wild yeasts and bacteria can arrive on flour, in water, and from the environment. So a wet mixture, left long enough, may begin to bubble without any packaged leavener at all, especially if it's refreshed with fresh flour and water from time to time. Often, lactic acid bacteria join in too, bringing a gently tangy note and helping dough keep longer. The practical point is that fermentation is a condition, not a brand name. Give microbes food, moisture, and time, and fermentation often follows. Historians often point to ancient Egypt as an early center of widespread leavened bread, likely helped by the close relationship between baking and brewing. Salt looks like a small ingredient, but it acts like a control knob that makes bread more predictable and more distinctly bread in flavor. In many lean doughs, salt is around 2% of the flour weight, which is enough to change the whole result without tasting overtly salty. Salt strengthens gluten, so dough holds its shape better, and it slows fermentation, so the rise is steadier and easier to time, especially when the room is warm and the dough would otherwise race ahead. If a loaf seems to rise too fast, spread too wide, or taste flat and bland, missing or very low salt is one of the first things worth checking. Grain farming mattered for bread because it made flour supply steady, not because bread suddenly became possible. Early agriculture in several regions focused on grains like wheat and barley, partly because they store dry for long periods and mill into usable flour on demand. That turns a harvest into months of food, travels well, and resists spoilage in a way that many fresh foods do not. A household scale comparison is keeping dependable pantry staples versus relying on whatever is fresh that week. Grain lets you plan meals through lean seasons, and milling can happen in small batches so flour stays usable. That storage advantage helps explain why grain-based breads became dependable staples in many regions. Bread has often been tied to survival and society because it concentrates calories into a form that travels and can be counted. Many records describe grain or bread rations being used to pay workers or support large groups. Because flour is easy to measure and loaves can be distributed consistently, whether for labor, travel, or long projects. In everyday terms, bread behaves like an edible unit you can divide into slices or pieces without changing its basic usefulness at the table. Counting loaves or portions is often simpler than counting bowls of cooked food, and that practicality still matters when food has to be shared fairly. And then comes the final transformation from dough to bread, which happens quickly in the oven, even though it's built on slower steps beforehand. As the center heats, starches absorb water and set into a tender crumb, while the surface dries and browns through reactions between sugars and proteins, building a stronger outer shell and that familiar toasty aroma. Early in baking, trapped gases expand for a brief final lift. And then the structure firms up and holds as heat moves inward and moisture moves outward. Once the dough gets hot enough, fermentation slows and stops. A short cooling pause afterward lets steam redistribute so slices stay cleaner. And with that in mind, the most useful next step is to look closely at what flour really is before anything else touches it. Flour is grain ground small enough that water can reach it evenly, whether the grain is wheat, rye, corn, rice, or something else. And even before yeast or salt enter the picture, the grind quietly sets the starting point for your dough. If you don't feel like memorizing anything tonight, you don't have to. Just notice this one gentle idea. Particle size changes how quickly flour drinks water, and that changes how dough feels in your hands. Fine flour has far more surface area than coarse meal, the way powdered sugar seems to vanish faster than crunchy sugar crystals. Because there are more tiny edges for water to cling to, fine flour hydrates quickly and tends to make a smoother, more cohesive mixture. It usually comes together faster, stretches more easily, and shapes with less tearing. Coarser flour keeps larger particles that soak more slowly, which can make a dough feel stiff at first and then relax as it rests, even if you haven't changed the recipe or added more liquid. Water keeps moving inward over time, softening those larger pieces. And there's another quiet detail. Coarse particles can pack differently in a measuring cup, which nudges hydration without you noticing. Once you see that how finely it's ground affects how quickly water is absorbed, it becomes easier to accept why two bags, both labeled wheat flour, can still ask for slightly different handling. Milling is not only about grinding grain, it's also about deciding how much of the kernel stays in the bag. And that single choice changes flavor, color, and shelf life in one move. A useful word here is extraction, which simply means how much of the whole grain ends up as flour. Lower extraction flour is closer to the pure, pale, starchy center. Higher extraction flour keeps more of the outer layers and the nutrient-rich core mixed in. Many common white flours are made from a smaller portion of the kernel, while higher extraction flours often look a little tan or speckled because tiny bran bits remain. You can think of it like choosing how much whole grain character you want in the final bag. Modern roller mills commonly separate the kernel into streams and then recombine them in very controlled ways. That's one reason supermarket flour can feel so consistent from bag to bag. Stone milling, on the other hand, more often crushes the grain as a whole, leaving more natural oils and fine bran in the flour. That can deepen flavor and aroma, but it can also shorten storage life, because oils don't keep as quietly as dry starch. Neither approach is better for every purpose. They're just different starting points, and the difference in what is kept leads straight into why wheat, in particular, became the backbone grain for so many raised breads. Wheat is the grain that most naturally turns into tall, airy bread because its storage proteins can link up into an elastic network when water and mixing bring them into contact. The two main protein groups are commonly described as glutenin and gliadin. Together, they form gluten, a stretchy net that can expand while still holding on to the carbon dioxide made during fermentation. It helps to picture it as a flexible mesh, strong enough to hold bubbles, but loose enough to stretch as those bubbles grow. Without water, those proteins stay inert. Without some mixing, folding, or time, the network stays weak. That's why a dry blend can't trap gas, and why an underdeveloped dough tends to spread instead of holding a rounded shape. Once gluten is the core idea, A very practical, everyday clue is the flour's protein content because it hints at how strong that net can become. In the US, you might see protein listed on the nutrition label as grams per serving, and some brands share a percentage in their baking specs. However it's presented, the trend is the same. Higher protein usually supports a stronger gluten network. Many cake flours sit roughly around 7 to 9% protein. All-purpose flour often lands near 10 to 12%. Bread flour commonly sits around 12 to 14%, and specialty high-gluten flours for bagels can run higher. The exact number varies by brand and by country, but a few percentage points can still change how a dough behaves. Higher protein flour can help a loaf hold a tall shape, or help a pizza crust stay pleasantly chewy. Lower protein flour tends to make a more tender crumb. Protein content also affects how much water the flour can comfortably absorb before the dough feels slack and sticky. This is one reason two all-purpose flours can feel different. They may not be identical in protein, milling, or conditioning. And if someone is aiming for more lift with a low-protein flour, a common baker's trick is to add a small amount of vital wheat gluten to strengthen the network. You don't need to chase perfection here. It's simply a lever you can recognize when the dough seems too weak, too tight, or too delicate. When whole grains enter, protein has to share the stage with what bran and germ do to structure. Whole wheat flour includes the bran and germ along with the endosperm, so it carries more fiber, minerals, and flavorful oils. It also changes how dough behaves. Bran acts like tiny flakes that interrupt the gluten web, and those edges can cut through developing strands. That's one reason whole grain loaves often rise less and feel denser, even when the yeast is active, especially if the dough is mixed hard and fast. Whole wheat also tends to absorb more water, so a dough that looks perfect with white flour can feel tight and underhydrated after a full swap. A brief rest often helps. As the dough sits, water migrates, the bran softens, and the mixture evens out, which can make shaping calmer and less sticky. And because the germ contains oils that can go stale, whole wheat flour benefits from cooler storage. Keeping it in the freezer slows the stalling of those oils and helps the flavor stay clean. White flour is mostly the endosperm, the inner starchy center of the kernel, and that's why it tends to make bread that is lighter in color and more uniform in crumb. Removing most bran and germ reduces extra oils and sharp particles, so gluten can form more smoothly, and the flour can store longer without the same risk of rancid flavors. That longer shelf life is one reason white flour became a reliable pantry staple in many households. In the United States, many white flours are enriched, meaning some B vitamins and iron are added back. You'll often see thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, and iron listed, which is why enriched wheat flour appears so often on ingredient lists for bread, buns, and tortillas. You may also see bleached and unbleached options. They can behave slightly differently, but the most practical takeaway is simple. Switching brands or types may call for a small water adjustment because absorption and conditioning are never perfectly identical. Flour also doesn't stay chemically identical from the moment it's milled because it continues to react with oxygen in the air. Over days and weeks, oxygen can naturally condition flour, so it develops gluten a bit more predictably and may feel slightly less sticky at the same hydration. Unbleached flour also lightens in color gradually for this reason, which is part of why an older bag can sometimes seem to behave better than a freshly opened one. especially in lean doughs. Some commercial flours use treatments to speed or standardize that conditioning. Bleaching agents can brighten flour and alter how it performs. And dough improvers, such as ascorbic acid, can strengthen gluten and help consistency. None of this has to feel intimidating. The label is usually the best place to see what was used without guessing. And once conditioning makes sense, it's easier to accept that different wheats, older wheat relatives, and other grains may ask for gentler mixing or slightly different timing, even when the ingredient list looks familiar. Despite the name, ancient grains are not one thing, but a mix of older wheat relatives and traditional grains that bring different flavors and different dough behavior. Spelt and einkorn, for example, can form gluten, but many bakers find the doughs feel softer, spread more easily, and turn sticky if mixed as aggressively as strong modern bread flour. In practice, gentler mixing and careful shaping often work better than chasing maximum strength. These grains can also brown and ferment a bit differently because their starch and enzyme balance isn't identical to modern wheat. That can shift proofing times and change when the crumb sets in the oven. Some people also report that breads made with these grains feel easier to digest, but that's inconsistent and personal, so it's safest to treat the difference as flavor, texture, and handling first. If you enjoy the taste, that's enough reason to use them. And if they feel tricky, a blend with strong wheat flour often makes the process calmer. Rye flour works by different rules than wheat flour because rye doesn't build the same stretchy gluten network. Instead, rye relies more on starch gels and water-binding fibers for structure. Those fibers are often called pentosans, and you don't have to remember the name. The feeling is the important part. Rye drinks a lot of water, and rye dough can feel pasty and sticky rather than elastic. That's why rye formulas often look surprisingly high in hydration compared to wheat breads like sandwich loaves or baguettes. And because rye structure depends so much on starch and water, many rye loaves are baked in pans for support. Sourdough fermentation is also common because acidity can help the crumb set more cleanly and reduce the gummy texture that can show up in high rye breads. Once you understand that rye is a water and starch story more than a gluten story, it becomes easier to handle it with patience instead of force. With flour types clear, the next lever is water itself, and how hydration shifts dough from stiff and tight to slack and sticky. Hydration is the amount of water in a dough compared to the amount of flour, and bakers usually express it as a percentage. That way, it stays consistent when you scale a recipe up or down. If a dough is at 65% hydration, it has 65 grams of water for every 100 grams of flour. That simple ratio lets you compare formulas even when one batch is a single loaf and another is a dozen. It also offers a quiet preview of how the dough will feel in your hands and how the finished bread may feel when you tear it open. This is one of the reasons weights beat volume for bread. A cup of flour can vary depending on how it's scooped and packed. Different flours also drink water differently, even when they look similar. So the same number of cups can produce dough that is tight and resistant one day, and loose and sticky the next. Hydration becomes a dial that touches both handling now and texture later. It influences how moist the finished bread feels and how much moisture it must bake off to set properly. If you don't feel like holding on to the numbers tonight, you don't have to. The main idea is that water sets the mood of the dough. Different breads live in different hydration neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods line up with texture and handling in a surprisingly reliable way. Bagel dough often sits in a firm, low hydration range, commonly around 50 to 58%. That stiffness helps it shape cleanly, and it holds up through boiling without losing its form. Many American sandwich loaves live a little higher, often around 60 to 70%, so the crumb stays soft, even, and easy to slice. Enriched pan breads, where you add fat and sugar, can feel stiffer than you expect, so they often benefit from a touch more water to reach the same softness. Lean hearth loaves like baguettes often sit in the mid-60s to the low 70s. That range is wet enough to expand well, but still structured enough to score cleanly and hold a long shape rather than spreading wide. Then there are high hydration styles like ciabatta and some rustic loaves, which can climb roughly into the 75 to 85% neighborhood. At that point, the dough can feel less like firm clay and more like a thick paste. If fermentation and structure cooperate, that extra water sets the stage for larger holes. You don't need to memorize any of those ranges. They're simply signposts. Lower hydration tends to feel firmer and easier to shape. Higher hydration tends to feel stickier and more open, and it asks for a different kind of patience. Water temperature matters too, because yeast and flour enzymes work faster in warmth and slower in cool conditions. The same ingredients can follow a shorter or longer timeline depending on the temperature you start with. Warm water can get fermentation moving sooner when a room is chilly. Cool water buys time and can prevent dough from racing ahead in a warm environment. That can be useful if you want the rise to fit a workday, or if you're planning an overnight rest. Many bakers keep mixing water in a comfortable lukewarm range and avoid water that feels very hot. Too much heat can stress yeast, and it can also change how the dough feels before fermentation even gets going. On the other hand, cool water pairs naturally with refrigerator fermentation. In very warm weather, some people even use very cold water, so the dough starts cooler, and the early rise stays steady instead of sudden, even with the same yeast amount. Temperature, in other words, is a simple way to nudge time without changing the recipe. Hydration also matters because gluten cannot form until flour proteins absorb water. Water lets those proteins unfold and interact. In wheat dough, they knit into an elastic structure that traps carbon dioxide. So, hydration is the first requirement for a loaf that rises upward instead of spreading outward. It's also a big reason wheat flour outperforms many other grains in lofty bread. When there's too little water, the network stays incomplete and prone to tearing. When there's more water, the dough has room to move. The proteins can align more easily, and the network can share stress across the dough instead of snapping in one weak spot. That's why a well-developed wetter dough can stretch far without breaking, even though it may start out feeling sticky. Once the network is continuous, it can hold gas like many tiny balloons. The loaf gains lift and spring, and the crumb becomes cleaner and more sliceable instead of collapsing into a dense, tight layer. Hydration doesn't work alone, but it sets the conditions for structure to form in the first place. If you remember only one thing, let it be this: water is what turns flour from dust into a living, stretchable system. Another gentle truth is that dough keeps absorbing water after mixing. That delayed absorption is why a dough can feel stiff at first, and then relax, or feel sticky at first, and then become more manageable, even when the recipe is fixed. Hidden dry pockets slowly disappear as water distributes through the flour. Starch granules take in moisture gradually, Whole grain flours have bran that hydrates more slowly than white flour, so the texture can shift over 10 to 30 minutes, especially at higher hydrations or with thirsty flours. This delayed hydration is also why it's easy to over-dry dough by adding extra flour too early. Sometimes, what the dough really needed was time, not more flour. Given a short rest, the stickiness often calms down. The dough smooths out, stretch improves, and what felt ragged becomes more elastic. In practice, this is one of the easiest no-effort tricks in bread. If the dough feels messy, pause first. Let it sit, then decide if any adjustment is truly needed. Autolyze is a rest that uses this idea on purpose. Flour and water sit together, usually by themselves for a short time before salt and yeast are added. The point is better dough development with less aggressive mixing. During the rest, water hydrates the flour thoroughly, and gluten begins forming on its own. Many bakers find the dough becomes more extensible and less prone to tearing at the same hydration. Whole grain doughs often benefit too, because the bran has time to soften and later shaping can feel more forgiving. A common autolysis is about 20 to 60 minutes. That's long enough for hydration to even out and for the dough to feel more cohesive, while still short enough that fermentation isn't the focus. During this rest, enzymes also have a little time to free up sugars, which can support browning and a rounder flavor later. Another quiet advantage is that autolysis can reduce mixing time. Less mixing means less friction heat, which can help you keep the dough on a steadier schedule. Water itself has differences beyond temperature, because minerals dissolved in water can change how dough feels. Harder water can make dough seem a touch tighter and stronger at the same hydration. Very soft water can leave dough feeling a little looser. That's one reason a formula that feels perfectly balanced in one place can feel stickier or more slack somewhere else, even when the flour and weights are identical. Water chemistry varies region to region, and sometimes even between tap sources. In practical terms, the adjustment is usually small. It's more like a few grams of water difference than a full redesign of the recipe, but it can show up in shaping, proof height, and how well the dough holds its form after it's moved or scored. If someone bakes with very hard well water or very soft water from a home softener, they may notice the difference more strongly. Some bakers use filtered or bottled water, mainly to keep one variable steady from week to week, not because the tap is bad, but because consistency is calming. Salt changes hydration in its own way too. Once salt dissolves, it changes how water moves through the dough and how the dough feels. That's why salt can make dough feel firmer and less slippery at the same hydration. A dough that seems unmanageably sticky without salt can feel more cohesive once the salt fully dissolves and tightens structure, especially when it's evenly dispersed. Salt also slows fermentation. Part of that is simple osmotic pressure, which affects yeast activity and helps keep the rise steadier and easier to time. This is also why concentrated pockets of salt can be a problem. If salt sits in one place instead of dissolving and spreading, it can inhibit yeast locally. The fix is simple and gentle. Give salt time to melt into the dough and mix until it's evenly distributed. Once it's dissolved, the whole loaf tends to behave more consistently from the first rise to the final crumb. You don't have to treat salt like a fragile laboratory ingredient. Just remember that it needs time and evenness to do its quiet work. Higher hydration tends to encourage a more open crumb because wetter dough is more extensible. It can expand around growing gas pockets without tearing as easily. Instead of bubbles popping or being squeezed back down, they have a better chance to grow. The walls between them can stay thinner. With more water present, more steam is generated in the oven. That steam supports early expansion before the crumb sets, and it also keeps the surface flexible long enough for the loaf to fully open instead of sealing shut too soon. Hydration alone does not guarantee big holes. It sets the conditions that make them possible. Big, airy pockets also depend on fermentation that builds strength, on handling that preserves gas instead of pressing it out, and on baking long enough that the center sets and dries a little instead of staying gummy. Once you start thinking this way, hydration becomes the backdrop for the next topic. Water helps create a structure that can stretch. Fermentation is the process that actually inflates that structure and turns dough into something light. And with that, the next step is to follow the rise itself and to see how time, yeast, and bacteria quietly do the lifting that hydration made possible. Yeast used for bread is a living, single-celled fungus. In dough, its main job is simple. It turns available sugars into carbon dioxide and a little alcohol. The carbon dioxide is the lifting gas that inflates the dough like countless tiny balloons pressing outward at once. In wetter doughs, some of that gas can dissolve at first, a little like carbonation in a drink, before it gathers into bubbles where the dough is elastic enough to hold it. The alcohol mostly helps build aroma during fermentation, and then it bakes away. Yeast can keep working even when you add no table sugar, because flour already contains small natural sugars, and flour enzymes slowly clip some starch into more sugars over time. If that chain makes sense, the next practical piece is choosing a yeast amount that matches the rise schedule you want without guessing. Even a very small measurement of yeast represents an enormous population. That's why a fraction of a teaspoon can raise a full loaf. Many references describe a gram of active dry yeast as containing on the order of billions of cells, with the exact count varying by brand, freshness, and storage conditions. A standard US yeast packet is about 7 grams, often listed as 2 1/4 teaspoons. So the starting crowd is already huge. Most of the time, the main dial you are turning is speed, not whether fermentation will begin. Many lean breads use well under a single packet per loaf, while sweet rolls may use more to push through doughs weighed down with fat and sugar. And for long, cold schedules, some doughs use only a few tenths of a percent yeast by flour weight, which can be just a pinch in a home batch, while same-day breads often use closer to 1 or 2%. You don't have to hold on to those numbers. The feeling to remember is that less yeast usually means more time, and more time usually means more flavor. Most packaged baking yeast in the United States is a cultivated strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's selected because it is reliable and tends to produce a familiar, mild bread profile. The value of commercial yeast is consistency across batches. So a recipe behaves similarly week to week, even if room temperature shifts a little, flour absorption varies, or your rise container changes shape. Active dry yeast and instant yeast are usually the same species processed into different granules. The practical difference is how quickly they hydrate and begin working. That's why instant yeast is commonly mixed right into flour, while active dry is often dissolved first, especially when the dough is cool and hydration is slower. You may also see labels like rapid rise, bread machine, or sweet dough yeast. Those versions are typically tuned for faster starts or better performance in sugary doughs. Once you know what you're using, it becomes easier to focus on what fermentation is doing, besides making the dough taller. Fermentation makes bread taste like more than flour and water. It creates new compounds and rearranges existing ones in ways baking later amplifies. As yeast and enzymes work, they generate alcohols, mild organic acids, and aromatic molecules. They also increase the pool of sugars that later brown into deeper crust flavor. That's one reason long fermented doughs often color more readily, even at the same bake temperature. Most of the ethanol produced does not remain in the finished bread because it evaporates readily during baking. But it still matters as part of the chain that builds aroma and complexity. It's a little like a sauce that simmers. Some of what's made disappears as steam, but the flavor doesn't vanish with it. When fermentation runs longer, you often taste it as clearer grain character and a less one-note sweetness. Yeast activity also isn't perfectly steady from start to finish. Yeast does not stay at the same head count during fermentation because it can multiply as it feeds. That growth can make dough seem to speed up after a quiet start. Yeast reproduces by budding, and under favorable conditions, it can multiply on the scale of hours, though the exact pace depends on temperature, hydration, early oxygen, and sugar availability. In everyday terms, rise speed is rarely a straight line. Yeast first wakes up and adjusts to its environment. Then it grows. Only after that can gas production feel noticeably stronger and the dough begin to dome, especially in the warmer core of a larger batch. Later, as food becomes less available and byproducts accumulate, activity can slow again. Timing is always a balance, and temperature is the simplest lever to keep that balance steady. Temperature is the most direct lever for fermentation speed. Warmer dough generally ferments faster, and cooler dough ferments slower. On a home scale, the comparison is simple. The same formula can take much longer on a cool day than it does on a warm day, even when every measurement is identical. Warm mixing water can shorten timelines. Cooler water can lengthen them, often without changing anything else about the ingredient list. During baking, yeast-driven rise ends early because yeast cannot survive once the dough heats past the temperatures it can tolerate. That happens in the first phase of baking, while the loaf is still setting and expanding. This is also why very hot water is risky at the beginning. Water that feels uncomfortably hot can stress yeast before the dough even starts. Many bakers aim for liquids that feel comfortably warm rather than hot, because it's a simple way to protect the yeast and keep the schedule predictable. And because dough temperature matters more than air temperature, bakers often think in terms of a desired dough temperature, not just the weather in the room. Cold fermentation is a deliberate slowdown. It uses the refrigerator to stretch time so flavor can deepen without the dough rushing past its peak. In the cold, yeast produces gas more slowly, but flour enzymes can keep freeing sugars and gently changing the dough's chemistry. That often supports better browning and a more developed wheat flavor without needing extra yeast. Many home bakers use an overnight rest, roughly 8 to 24 hours. That hold can happen either as one big mass of dough or after shaping, because the principle is the same. Slow the clock and let flavor accumulate while the dough stays under control. Typical refrigerator temperatures sit around the high 30s to low 40s Fahrenheit, where yeast is still active, just patient. Some bakers call this cold retardation, meaning a slowed rise. The word sounds technical, but the idea is simple. You're giving the dough time to become tastier while keeping it from sprinting. Even with that control, dough can still go too far. Overproofing is what happens when dough rises beyond what its structure can support. Usually, that means yeast has consumed much of the available food, and the gluten network has stretched too far and weakened. The dough may look very puffy, but feel fragile. It can deflate when moved or scored, then bake into a flatter loaf with a tighter, duller interior because it cannot hold gas under stress. It's like an overinflated balloon that has thinned out. A simple sign is low resilience, where a fingertip indentation does not spring back well. Another clue is a surface that starts to look slack or slightly wrinkled instead of smooth and taut, especially late in a warm proof when expansion outruns recovery. If it happens, the usual correction is gentle. Deflate, reshape, and shorten the next rise. Not as a punishment, but as a reset. Sourdough fermentation differs from straight yeast bread because it is driven by a community, not a single standardized strain. A sourdough starter contains wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria working together. The bacteria are similar in broad function to the ones used in yogurt and pickles. They produce lactic and acetic acids that change flavor and also influence dough behavior. Often, acidity can tighten gluten slightly and shift enzyme activity, which can make long fermentation feel steadier and more structured. Those acids lower the dough's pH, which can discourage some spoilage organisms and help the loaf keep a bit longer at room temperature compared with similar bread made quickly. They also nudge the flavor toward mild tang or sharper notes depending on conditions like temperature, time, and how the starter is fed. Wild yeast still provides carbon dioxide lift, but the culture's balance depends on how it is refreshed over time. Feeding schedules, hydration of the starter, and temperature all influence which microbes dominate and how fast they work. That is why sourdough timelines can feel more variable than commercial yeast timelines, and why the dough can ask for a different kind of attention. You're not only watching height, you're watching strength. You're watching how the dough holds its shape as it fills with gas. And that brings us naturally to dough development, the quiet work of building and maintaining strength. So the gases fermentation creates stay trapped long enough to become a loaf. Kneading turns a rough mix into dough that can stretch and hold gas. It does this by helping gluten become one continuous network instead of many weak, separate threads. I like to picture netting or a woven bag. A handful of loose strings will fall apart. A connected mesh can carry pressure across a wide area without splitting in one spot. In dough, that pressure is carbon dioxide made during fermentation. So a better network usually means the loaf rises higher, the crumb looks more even, and slices hold together instead of shedding crumbs. When the mesh becomes continuous, it can trap thousands of tiny bubbles and keep them separated as they grow. You can often see the change in a smoother surface and a stretch that resists tearing. And once you can recognize that feel, it becomes easier to choose the right level of development before proofing and the first minutes of baking. Gluten development is not about making dough as strong as possible. Different breads need different balances between elasticity and extensibility, and those two qualities pull in opposite directions. Elastic dough springs back and resists stretching. That spring supports tidy shapes like sandwich loaves, hamburger buns, and bagels. But too much spring can fight rolling and tightening, and it can leave a loaf that feels dense rather than soft. Extensible dough stretches farther without tearing. That quality supports open interiors in rustic loaves and high hydration styles like ciabatta. It also helps pizza dough open easily without snapping back. But too much extensibility can make a dough slump and spread, especially when it is baked freeform without a pan or basket for support. If the labels feel technical, you can let them drift by. The simple question is, does the dough snap back stubbornly, or does it stretch so far that it loses its shape? Mixing, flour strength, hydration, and fermentation time influence this balance. Strong flour and firmer dough tend to push toward elasticity. Higher hydration and longer fermentation can make dough more extensible. Temperature matters too, because warmer dough relaxes faster. And when the balance is off, you usually see it first in shaping. A dough that snaps back will fight you when you try to roll it tight or widen it into a round. A dough that is too relaxed will spread before you're ready, and it may feel like it cannot hold tension on the surface. Time can build gluten even when you do less direct kneading. Hydrated proteins keep rearranging and bonding during rest and fermentation. Water continues to distribute. Small dry pockets disappear, and the network gradually aligns. This is one reason slow doughs can feel strong without feeling overworked. A dough that seems weak right after mixing can feel noticeably stronger an hour later, even if the only change is that it had time to organize. The same idea continues in the refrigerator, just more slowly. If you don't feel like working the dough tonight, that's okay. Time is one of the gentlest tools in bread. Because time does part of the work, readiness is easier to judge by behavior than by strict minutes. You can watch whether the dough holds a rounded shape after you pre-shape it. You can feel whether it stretches without tearing when you lift an edge. You can notice whether the surface is smoothing out. That observational approach also helps you make small corrections early, before the dough is fully risen. If it feels too tight, you may give it more rest. If it feels too slack, you may build strength with folds rather than adding flour. A practical sign of gluten development is that a small piece of dough can stretch thin before it tears. This is what the window pane test checks. You stretch a piece of dough gently until light can pass through. A useful result is a smooth stretch that finally fails in a clean tear, rather than an immediate rip into rough, jagged edges. You don't need perfection. The goal is simply more connected than before. Whole grain doughs often show a less perfect window pane because bran interrupts the sheet. Rye-heavy doughs follow different rules altogether, so the test is a checkpoint, not a requirement for every bread. Used after a brief rest, it can help you stop mixing sooner and avoid guessing. Once dough is developed enough, the next risk is pushing it past its useful range. Over-kneading is rare by hand, but it can happen in a stand mixer. A machine can apply strong, non-stop force and warm the dough through friction in a short time. When gluten is pushed too far, the network can begin to break down. The dough may turn sticky, slack, and prone to tearing, even though it looks thoroughly mixed and may even look very smooth at first. One clue is that the dough stops gaining strength and instead begins to smear or cling in a way that suggests it cannot hold itself together as a cohesive mass. Another clue is a shiny, taffy-like stretch that tears rather than holds tension. Dough temperature can rise noticeably in a mixer, sometimes by several degrees in just a few minutes. And intense mixing can also increase oxidation. That can lighten dough color, and it can sometimes leave a loaf with a slightly duller wheat aroma and a paler crust than you expected. You don't have to worry about this in most everyday baking. It's simply a reason many bakers prefer staged strengthening methods, especially for doughs that are wetter, gentler, or meant to ferment for a long time. The calmer path is often better than the fastest path. Folding during fermentation builds strength without constant kneading. It is especially helpful for wetter doughs that are hard to work intensively without adding extra flour. A fold stretches the gluten network and stacks it onto itself, like layering fabric. That strengthens structure while keeping more gas inside than a full punch-down would, so the dough keeps some of the lift it has already earned. Folding also helps even out temperature and moves yeast and nutrients around, so fermentation proceeds more uniformly instead of racing in one spot and lagging in another. Methods like coil folds do the same job with even gentler handling. Because folds are brief and spaced out, they build strength while keeping the dough cooler than long, continuous kneading. They also tend to align the network so the dough holds shape better when it is finally formed for proofing. If you've ever noticed a dough that feels messy at first, but becomes smooth and buoyant after a couple of folds, you've felt this effect. It is strength built in small moments, not one long effort. Resting makes dough easier to shape because gluten relaxes over time. Relaxation reduces snapback that fights stretching and rolling, especially in strong doughs that were mixed firmly. Many breads use a bench rest of about 10 to 30 minutes. That's usually long enough for the dough to loosen without losing all support. Temperature, hydration, and how tightly the dough was handled can nudge the needed time shorter or longer. And colder dough often needs the longer end. In plain terms, rested dough stretches more smoothly and tears less. It becomes easier to build surface tension and a clean outer skin. It can also reduce how much extra flour you need during shaping, which helps the crumbs stay lighter. Once shaping feels controlled, you begin to notice how development changes when you add more than flour and water. Enriched doughs usually need longer development because fat, sugar, eggs, and dairy ingredients change how quickly gluten becomes a strong, continuous network. Fat coats some proteins and acts like a lubricant. That tenderizes the crumb, but can delay strength. Sugar competes for water, and at higher percentages, it can slow yeast, which is why sweet doughs often rise more slowly than lean doughs, even with the same yeast amount. Eggs bring both fat and protein, adding richness and structure together. Milk brings lactose and proteins that affect browning and softness. All of these ingredients can make dough feel softer, even while it is still underdeveloped, so the feel can be misleading at first. In very rich doughs, like brioche, butter can range from roughly a third to about half the flour weight. In those cases, strength is often built first, and enrichments are added in stages so the gluten network is not overwhelmed. The goal is a dough that becomes smooth and elastic while still holding enough structure to trap gas reliably. When it works, the crumb turns feathery and tender without collapsing. And when it doesn't, the dough can spread and bake heavy, not because the recipe is wrong, but because the network never got the chance to form before it was coated in richness. No-knead bread works because high hydration and long fermentation allow gluten to organize with very little direct mechanical work. Time becomes the main tool instead of intensity. The dough is wet enough that proteins can move and link easily. The long rest gives enzymes and fermentation time to strengthen structure gradually, often with a small amount of yeast, so the rise can stretch over roughly half a day to a full day without racing ahead. The trade is that later handling must stay gentle. The network built through time can be torn if you are rough right before baking. Rough handling can knock out gas and undo hours of slow development, leaving a tighter loaf than the formula promised. If you let the idea settle, dough development becomes less mysterious. You are building a network, either with hands, with folds, or with time. You are choosing a balance between spring and stretch. You are giving the dough rests so it can relax when you need it to shape. And once structure is understood, the next simple step is to see how the ingredients beyond flour and water, especially salt, sugar, and fats, steer texture and flavor in predictable ways in the finished loaf. Salt is the ingredient that makes bread taste fully present. It heightens grain flavor and keeps the crumb from tasting bland, even when the loaf is well browned and beautifully baked. In a lean dough, a common target is about 2% salt by flour weight. That works out to roughly 10 grams of salt for 500 grams of flour. It sounds small, but it's enough to shift the whole loaf without turning bread into a salty food. If you don't feel like remembering the number, you don't have to. The simple takeaway is that bread wants enough salt to taste awake, not enough to taste like a snack mix. Salt also changes how dough behaves. It strengthens gluten, so the dough feels a little tighter and more elastic. And it slows fermentation, so the rise becomes steadier and easier to time, especially in warm kitchens or when dough is held for a long proof. When salt is missing, you can often feel it right away. The dough may seem slack and sticky, and the flavor can turn strangely flat. If a loaf feels hard to control and tastes dull, missing or very low salt is one of the first clues worth checking before you change anything else. Sugar plays two roles, and the amount decides which role you get. In small amounts, sugar can help yeast get going. It's easy fuel at the start, which is why some recipes add a teaspoon to warm milk or water to wake yeast. But dough can ferment perfectly well without added sugar, because flour enzymes slowly create sugars as they work. So, sugar is optional in lean doughs. It's a tool, not a requirement. In larger amounts, sugar becomes a different kind of tool. Sweet rolls and brioche-style doughs often contain enough sugar that yeast has to work harder. Sugar pulls water toward itself, and that makes yeast cells feel thirsty. Rise times lengthen, and recipes often use more yeast, a richer preferment, or simply more time to compensate. Sugar also affects crust color. More sugar at the surface means faster browning and a deeper, shinier crust. That's why sweetbreads can look richly colored even when the crumb stays soft. And once you see sugar as both fuel and friction, it's easier to understand why enriched doughs ask for patience. Fats change bread in a quiet but powerful way. They tenderize by limiting how strongly gluten forms, and by lubricating the structure so the crumb feels softer and less chewy. Butter, oil, lard, and other fats coat some flour particles and proteins. That coating reduces how tightly gluten strands link, almost like adding a little oil, so strands don't cling as firmly together. The result is a softer bite and a more delicate tear. This is why a lean baguette feels chewy. Almost nothing interferes with gluten. And it's why a dinner roll feels plush, even at similar hydration. Fat and often dairy shift the texture toward tenderness. Because fat changes structure, enriched doughs often need more mixing time to build strength. They can feel soft early on, but still be underdeveloped inside. Once cooled, though, those same enriched loaves often slice cleanly and stay tender, which is part of why many sandwich-style breads include some fat, even when they are not obviously rich. Milk changes bread in several practical ways because it brings water, fat, milk proteins, and lactose. Each piece nudges texture and browning. Lactose is a sugar yeast, does not ferment well, so more of it remains for browning. That's why milk breads often color nicely, even at moderate oven temperatures, and why rolls brushed with milk can brown faster than lean loaves. Milk proteins support tenderness and can help a crumb feel softer. Milk fat adds richness, and it can slow stalling a bit, so a milk-based loaf often stays soft longer than a similar loaf made with water. Some recipes use milk powder when they want these benefits without changing hydration too much. Powder adds milk solids without adding much water, so you can keep the dough feel similar while still getting improved softness and browning. If you've ever tasted a loaf that feels gentle and pillowy, even the next day, milk solids are often part of the reason. Eggs add both fat and protein, so they deepen richness while also helping structure. They also contribute color in a way water-based doughs cannot. The yolk brings emulsifiers, including lecithin, that help fats and water mix smoothly. That can make the crumb feel fine and even, rather than coarse or dry. The white adds proteins that set during baking, supporting a loaf that holds its shape and slices neatly. Egg-enriched breads often have a more golden crumb. They can brown more readily as well, especially when an egg wash is used on the surface. An egg wash does two things at once. It encourages browning, and it creates shine because proteins set into a thin film as the loaf bakes. And because eggs add liquid as well as solids, swapping whole eggs for whites or yolks changes more than flavor. It changes the balance of tenderness and structure. That's why recipes that specify one or the other are usually aiming at a particular texture, not just a particular taste. Honey and malt bring sweetness, but their bigger bread effect is how they change available sugars, moisture, and long fermentation behavior. Honey is mostly glucose and fructose, which yeast can use. Honey also attracts water, which can soften the crumb and help bread feel moist. It can make dough feel slightly stickier at the same hydration because it is a concentrated syrup, and it can deepen browning because it brings ready sugars to the surface. Malted barley products are a different story. Some are mainly flavor. Some are mainly enzymes. Diastatic malt powder contains active enzymes that help convert starch into sugars. That can support fermentation and improve browning when flour is low in natural enzyme activity. But too much diastatic malt can push the crumb toward gummy because it creates more sugar and starch breakdown than the loaf can set cleanly. That's why the amounts are usually very small, often measured in fractions of a percent. Non-diastatic malt, by contrast, is mainly for flavor and color. It adds a toasty sweetness and richer browning without active enzymes. Knowing that one distinction helps avoid accidental texture problems in otherwise simple doughs. These enrichments also change how bread stays fresh. Fat slows staling, and that is one reason enriched breads stay soft longer than lean loaves, even when both were baked well. Stalling is mostly about starch molecules reorganizing and firming up as bread cools and sits. Fat interferes with that recrystallization, keeping the crumb more flexible. This is why brioche and milk bread often stay tender for days, while a baguette turns firm much sooner. Sugar and emulsifiers can support this softness as well. Sugar holds on to moisture. Emulsifiers help fats and water distribute more evenly through the crumb, which can keep texture smoother over time. This is also why packaged sandwich bread tends to stay pliable longer than a bakery hearth loaf designed for a crisp crust. The trade is that very rich doughs can lose crispness quickly. The crust may soften fast, and it may stay pale unless the formula includes enough sugars or dairy solids to support browning. Softness and crispness rarely peak at the same time. Bread usually chooses one direction and leans into it. Commercial bread improvers and conditioners exist mostly to make dough more forgiving. They are not there to create a new kind of bread. They simply make consistency easier, which is why they show up more in mass-produced loaves than in artisan formulas. Ascorbic acid, also known as vitamin C, is commonly used as an oxidizer that helps strengthen gluten and improve gas retention. That can help loaves rise taller and shape more consistently, especially when flour quality varies. Emulsifiers like mono and diglycerides can improve softness and slow staling by helping fats and water mix more evenly through the crumb. Enzymes, such as amylase, can increase available sugars for fermentation and browning over a longer rise. If you see dough conditioner on a label, it usually signals that kind of small help in the background. Homemade bread can still reach similar outcomes through careful fermentation, thoughtful mixing, and good shaping. Conditioners simply make it easier to hit the same result every time, even when the environment changes. If the labels feel like a lot, you can let them float by. The practical takeaway is that some breads are built for reliability and shelf life, and the ingredient list tells you how they do it. Despite the common belief that more add-ins always make bread better, many enrichments make dough more sensitive to timing and temperature. Sugar and fat both slow fermentation at higher levels, so sweet doughs often need longer proofing or slightly warmer conditions. Overproofing can show up suddenly once the structure is finally inflated, because enriched doughs often have less gluten strength to spare. This is why enriched rich doughs are often proofed to a slightly smaller final rise than lean doughs, and why pan support is common. The loaf can be wonderfully soft without being as self-supporting on a stone as a lean bull. With enrichments clear, the next practical skill is shaping. Shaping is where you decide whether that softer dough rises up neatly or spreads out into a wider, lower form. Shaping is the step where you turn a relaxed mass of dough into a form that can rise upward instead of spreading outward. The main mechanism is surface tension. By stretching the outer layer snugly around the dough, you create a thin skin that holds the interior gases in place, the way a pulled fabric cover keeps a cushion from slumping. That tension gives the loaf a clearer outline. It helps the loaf spring in the oven, and it often improves crumb evenness because the dough expands in a more organized direction. Once surface tension is set, the loaf's behavior becomes easier to read during proofing, because the dough is no longer just sitting there. It is gently holding itself together. The seam is the natural weak point in a shaped loaf, and placing it deliberately gives you control. For many freestanding loaves, bakers place the seam down so the top stays smooth and continuous. That smooth surface can stretch evenly as the loaf rises. The sealed underside stays tucked and protected. In other cases, the seam is left up in a proofing basket. Then, if the loaf is flipped out and baked seam side down without scoring, the seam can become a natural burst line. It is the easiest place for expansion to break through. Either way, the seam is not just a leftover fold. It is a planned location where the dough is either reinforced or allowed to open. Pre-shaping is the quiet step that makes final shaping easier. It is a brief, gentle first shaping that organizes the dough without trying to finalize the exact loaf form. The purpose is to gather the dough into a basic round or log, redistribute tension, and create a cleaner structure that will hold during a short bench rest. After that rest, the dough usually shapes more smoothly and resists tearing. Gluten relaxes. The surface becomes easier to tighten without dragging or ripping. This two-step approach is especially helpful for high hydration doughs that feel loose at first. Pre-shaping gives them a framework. Then the final shaping becomes less of a struggle and more of a simple decision. Final shaping is where you choose the loaf structure. The direction you fold and tighten influences how gas pockets align and how the crumb will look when sliced. A tighter shape generally supports a smaller, more even crumb, which is useful for sandwich bread. A gentler shape can preserve larger bubbles for a more open interior, as long as the dough has enough strength to hold them. Most shaping methods rely on folding the dough into itself to build internal layers, then sealing and tightening the surface so the loaf holds its form. You can picture it like smoothing a sheet over a pillow. The inside stays soft, but the outer surface becomes neat and supportive. Once the loaf is tightened, later handling matters more, because you have created a structure that you want to protect. Long loaves, like baguettes and batards, depend on controlled elongation. If you stretch unevenly, you can create thin spots that burst and thick spots that stay dense. A steady approach is to build a tight internal log through folds, then roll from the center outward with light pressure so thickness stays consistent rather than pulling hard at the ends. If the center stays much thicker than the tips, the loaf bakes unevenly and may split unpredictably. If the ends get too thin, they can dry out and bake too quickly. It also helps to avoid overflowing the bench, because the dough needs a little grip to create tension during rolling. Consistent diameter is not only about appearance. It helps the loaf bake at a more uniform rate and supports even oven spring along the length. Scoring is the next layer of control. A score is a planned cut on the surface that tells the loaf where to expand. Dough will open at the weakest point once internal pressure rises in the oven, so scoring is simply choosing that point on purpose. A shallow or angled cut can lift a flap of dough that turns into an ear on artisan loaves. Deeper or straighter cuts create wider openings that vent steam and relieve pressure more directly. You do not have to memorize patterns to understand the goal. The goal is predictability. Without a score, a taut loaf may rupture at random along a seam or a thin spot. That can create a lopsided shape, and sometimes a denser zone where gas escapes too quickly. A clean score is a small decision that helps the loaf open where you want it to open. Round loaves, often called boules, tend to rise in a balanced way because tension can be distributed in all directions rather than concentrated along one long axis. When you tighten dough into a sphere, the skin shares stress evenly. Expansion is less likely to favor one side. It is more likely to lift the loaf upward as a whole. This shape can be forgiving for beginners because small imperfections in tightening are less obvious than they are in long loaves. The loaf is also less prone to twisting or bending during proofing and transfer. A well-shaped boule creates a fairly consistent thickness from center to edge. That supports a more even bake, and it makes the crumb easier to read when you are looking for fermentation clues later. Braided breads like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 use shaping as both design and support. The dough must be developed enough to stretch into strands without tearing. Each strand is essentially a narrow loaf. Braiding layers those strands so they hold each other in place as they expand. That is why the seams between strands need to be pinched firmly. If they are left loose, the braid can separate as the loaf rises and bakes. Braids also expose more surface area and create ridges, so they brown more unevenly than smooth loaves. The high points often color deeper while the valleys stay lighter. That uneven color is normal and part of the style. In braided breads, the pattern is not only decoration, it is structure. Some loaves benefit from extra support during their final rise. Proofing baskets, often called bannetons, support shaped dough, especially wet doughs that would otherwise spread. The basket provides sidewalls that encourage upward expansion. The lining or ridged surface can leave a flower pattern that becomes visible after baking. That pattern is texture, but it is also a quiet indicator of how the dough sat during proof. Using a basket can also make handling sticky dough easier because the loaf can be turned out quickly and scored while it still holds its rounded form. If the dough is very soft, that quick, clean transfer can preserve more gas and keep the shape intact. The final proof is usually judged by both expansion and feel. Many bakers aim for a noticeable rise after shaping, but not always a full doubling. As a rule of thumb, something like a half rise is often enough for many freestanding loaves because the loaf still has strength in reserve for oven spring. A loaf that doubles at this stage may have used most of its remaining structure, leaving less spring and more risk of collapse or sideways spread, especially without a pan. Underproofed dough often shows the opposite problem. It can tear or burst because internal pressure rises faster than the surface can open where you want it to. The crumb can look tighter because the gas had less time to organize before baking set it in place. A simple way to judge proof is resilience. If you press gently with a fingertip, the dough should spring back slowly and partially, not snap back immediately, and not stay sunken without movement. Different doughs behave differently, and temperature changes everything, so the finger test is only a clue. The larger idea is that you are looking for a dough that feels alive and airy, but still supported. You want it to hold its shape when moved. You want it to feel slightly buoyant under the skin you built during shaping. With shaping and proofing dialed in, the next step is the oven's transformation. Heat, steam, and time turn that planned structure into crust and crumb. Oven spring is the short burst of rising that happens early in baking, before the interior has fully set. In many loaves, It shows up in roughly the first part of the bake, when the dough is still able to stretch. Heat makes the gases already trapped in the dough expand. Carbon dioxide that was dissolved in the dough's moisture can also come out of solution and join those bubbles, the way carbonation releases more quickly as a drink warms. Yeast may produce extra gas for a brief time as the dough passes through warm temperatures that are still comfortable for it. But yeast-driven rise ends quickly once the dough gets hot enough. In practice, oven spring is mainly trapped gas expanding while the surface and crumb can still move. Some of that lift also comes from water turning to steam inside the dough, because steam takes up far more space than liquid water and pushes outward until the crumb begins to set. Because expansion happens first, early surface conditions matter. Steam in the oven at the beginning of baking supports that early rise by keeping the surface flexible. When the surface stays moist, it can stretch instead of locking into a rigid shell. Scoring cuts can open where you intended instead of sealing shut and forcing the loaf to tear somewhere else. If you don't remember anything else about steam, remember the timing. Early steam helps expansion. Later dryness supports a crisp crust. At home, bakers create steam in a few reliable ways. One is baking in a covered pot, which traps the moisture the dough releases and turns it into a little cloud around the loaf. Another is placing a preheated tray in the oven and adding hot water so it flashes into steam during the first minutes. Some people add a small amount of water to a hot pan or use a spray bottle carefully, then vent the oven later. The method matters less than the sequence. Give the loaf a humid start so it can expand, then let the oven dry out so the crust can firm in color. In many recipes, steam is kept for the first portion of the bake, then removed so crispness can develop without the surface staying rubbery. While the surface is stretching and drying, the interior is moving towards set. The crumb sets when starch granules absorb heat and water and gel into a stable framework, and wheat proteins firm so the loaf stops behaving like a soft paste. This happens across a range rather than at a single instant. That is why crust color alone is not a perfect doneness test. The outside can brown long before the center is finished, especially in larger loaves. Many bakers use internal temperature as a practical checkpoint. For lean wheat breads, an internal temperature in the low 200s. Fahrenheit is often a sign that the center is set enough to finish cleanly after cooling. Smaller breads can be done sooner, and very large loaves later. The useful idea is not that every loaf shares one exact number, but that the center has to reach a setting range. A probe thermometer makes this simple. It separates brown enough from set enough, and it lets you focus on the next visible change, the surface drying into crust. Crust formation begins with drying. As long as the surface is wet, evaporation holds the surface temperature down and delays firming. As moisture escapes, the outermost layer becomes less stretchy and starts acting like a thin shell. That shell thickens as drying continues. A simple anchor is boiling versus frying. Water keeps food near the boiling point, but a dry surface can get hot enough to crisp and brown. Bread works the same way. While the surface is wet, it stays cooler. Once it dries, it can climb into higher temperatures where browning reactions become powerful. Starch at the surface can gel into a thin film that later becomes crisp. How quickly that film dries depends on humidity and airflow in the oven. This is why covered baking changes crust. A lid holds humidity and delays drying, which supports expansion. When you remove the lid, the surface temperature can rise quickly, and crust color often deepens soon after. The moment you stop steaming or uncover a pot, you can almost feel the loaf switching gears, from stretching to drying. Most of the familiar toasted crust flavor comes from browning reactions between sugars and proteins once the surface is dry enough for higher heat. These reactions are commonly described as the Maillard reaction, working alongside caramelization. Together, they create many aroma molecules that read as roasted, nutty, and gently sweet. If the names feel technical, you can let them drift by. The practical meaning is simple. Browning needs a dry, hot surface. In many ovens, active browning begins once the crust surface climbs into the hotter range, which only happens after drying has progressed. Fermentation ties into this, because longer fermentation often increases available sugars. Flour enzymes have more time to convert some starch into sugars, leaving more fuel for browning without adding sweeteners. This is one reason long fermented loaves can color more readily, even at the same oven temperature. Extra surface sugars from honey, milk, or egg wash deepen color faster, too. That is why the same oven setting can produce a pale, lean loaf and a deeply browned, enriched loaf. Color is not only about heat, it is also about what sugars are waiting on the surface when heat finally arrives. Heat doesn't reach the loaf, only through the air. The baking surface changes how quickly the bottom sets, because direct contact transfers heat more efficiently than hot air alone. A preheated stone or steel stores energy and delivers it steadily. That helps the base of the loaf firm quickly, so it can support a strong early rise. A thin sheet pan cools when cold dough is loaded, so the bottom sets more slowly. This is also why bottom crust often browns sooner than the top, especially on dark metal pans that absorb and re-radiate heat efficiently. Small choices can soften or sharpen that bottom heat. Parchment paper can slightly insulate the base, which helps if bottoms darken too fast. Rack position matters as well. A loaf placed closer to the bottom element receives more bottom heat and may darken underneath sooner than it colors on top. These are not dramatic changes, but they are predictable ones. Once you see how the loaf receives heat from below, as well as from the air, the crust becomes easier to steer. As bread bakes, it loses a noticeable amount of water. Moisture is constantly moving from the interior toward the surface and leaving as steam. A finished loaf often ends up clearly lighter than the shaped dough, and much of that weight loss is water, not lost flour. The exact amount varies with loaf size, bake time, and whether the goal is a crisp crust or a soft one. Smaller loaves and rolls can lose moisture faster because they have more surface area relative to volume. Large loaves hold moisture longer and need more time for steam to work its way out. That moisture movement also explains why crust texture changes after baking. When more water leaves, the crust tends to stay crisper longer because there is less interior moisture available to soften it once the loaf cools. When less water leaves, the crumb may stay moister, but the crust can soften sooner. Neither outcome is wrong. They are style choices, and the bake can be adjusted depending on whether you want a crackling shell or a tender bite. Even after the loaf comes out of the oven, it keeps changing. Residual heat continues cooking the bread for several minutes because the crust and outer crumb are hotter than the center and heat keeps moving inward. During that short period, steam inside redistributes. The crumb firms as the gelled starch structure settles into a stable arrangement that slices more cleanly. Cutting very early can compress the interior and make it seem damp or gummy, even when the bread reached the right internal range, because moisture has not had time to equalize. In larger loaves, internal temperature can even rise a little after baking. That is normal carryover cooking, not extra browning. Once the loaf settles, the final difference most people notice is the crust. Crust thickness and chew are largely controlled by how long the bread stays in the oven after it has completed its main expansion. Extra time continues drying and deepening surface reactions. Leaving the bread in longer usually makes the crust thicker and the crumb slightly drier and more stable. Pulling it earlier leaves a thinner crust and a moister interior that may soften the outside as it cools. Many bakers also vent trapped steam near the end by uncovering a pot or briefly cracking the oven door, so the surface dries and the crust finishes crisp rather than leathery. Softer breads are often designed to avoid heavy drying. Pans, milk, fat, and sugar all encourage a tender crust and a softer bite, so a gentle crust can be a style choice rather than a baking mistake. From here, crust and crumb become a readable record of decisions. Their textures show what heat, steam, and time actually did, and in some rustic loaves, where a thin, well-dried shell cools into brittle layers, you can hear those decisions too, in the quiet crackle of a crust settling as the loaf cools. Crumb is the word for the inside structure of bread, and it is different from crumbs, the loose bits left on a board or plate. In a slice, the crumb is the set network of starch and proteins that once held gas bubbles. Its pattern is sometimes called the crumb grain, like the grain in wood that shows how the material formed. A fine, even crumb usually points to many small bubbles that stayed separate. A rustic, open crumb points to fewer, larger bubbles that were allowed to expand. Once you know the crumb is a kind of map, it becomes natural to read it for clues about hydration, fermentation, and handling. Open crumb, with irregular holes, is most likely when dough is wet enough to stretch easily and strong enough to keep bubbles from popping as they grow. Higher hydration makes dough more extensible, so bubbles can expand without tearing their walls. Gentle handling matters too, because it keeps existing bubbles from being squeezed back into the dough. Instead of turning large pockets into a uniform sponge, careful handling preserves variety. Strength is the third piece. Big bubbles need sturdy walls, and that strength comes from a continuous gluten network built through time, folds, or mixing. When open crumb shows up reliably, the next question is usually not, how do I get holes, but how controlled do I want those holes to be? Because some holes feel pleasant, and some signal a fixable shaping issue. A tight, even crumb is not a failure. It is a design choice that supports clean slices, spreads, and sandwiches without leaking fillings. Lower hydration naturally limits bubble expansion. More thorough degassing during shaping turns large bubbles into many smaller ones, which is why pan breads often look consistent from edge to edge. More complete mixing can also make crumb more uniform by distributing yeast activity and creating a smoother structure that supports many small cells rather than a few big ones. If the goal is predictability, that uniformity is a feature. And once that is clear, the most useful next detail is learning which bad holes are symptoms, not style. Large tunnels running through a loaf usually come from trapped pockets sealed in during shaping, not from extra good rise. A single big cavity often forms when the outer skin is tightened around a fold that enclosed air, or when the dough surface seals before gas can redistribute. Then one pocket grows, while nearby areas stay tight. This is why a loaf can look tall and still slice poorly, because the volume is concentrated in a few voids rather than spread across the crumb. If tunnels show up, the fix is often gentle and practical. During shaping, press out obvious big bubbles and seal folds more deliberately so you are not wrapping a pocket of air inside a tight skin. Once you start treating the crumb as feedback, crust becomes the next readable layer. Crust is a moisture story first, because crust is the zone where the loaf dried enough to become firm and brown. A hotter, shorter bake can create a thinner, crisper crust that shatters more easily. A longer bake typically dries deeper and builds a thicker shell that chews more, even if the loaf reaches the same internal doneness. Early humidity matters because it keeps the surface flexible. Late dryness matters because it determines how hard the shell sets. Two loaves, baked at the same temperature, can still have different crusts, depending on how much steam was present early and how quickly the oven dried later. If the crust feels right but looks dull, shine often comes down to what was on the surface before baking, not how good the bake was. A shiny crust usually comes from a thin layer of sugars or proteins that set into a smooth film in the oven. Egg wash adds proteins that coagulate into gloss. Milk adds lactose and proteins that brown and sheen. Even plain water can create some shine on certain breads if surface starch gels and smooths before drying fully. Some traditional styles use a starch wash, like a thin cornstarch and water mixture, because gelatinized starch dries into a clear, lightly glossy layer without adding egg or dairy. The surface coating is the reason, and the shine is the record. Chewiness is also easier to predict once you think in moisture. A chewy crust happens when the outer layer retains enough moisture to stay flexible while still being browned and set, rather than drying into a brittle shell. Enriched doughs tend to produce softer crust because fat and sugar keep the surface from drying as aggressively. The crumb can also hold more moisture, and that moisture migrates outward after baking and softens the crust from the inside. Lean, high-heat loaves more often cool into crisp crust because the outer layer dries more completely, leaving less water behind to re-soften it later. Crispness and chew are not moral judgments. They are outcomes of drying and migration. Cooling is part of that story, not an afterthought. As bread cools, the crumb often feels softer and more cohesive because steam inside condenses back into water and spreads through the starch gel. That redistribution is why a loaf can seem too wet if cut very early, then sliced cleanly later, even though nothing new happened except time for water to settle. At the same time, stalling begins as soon as the loaf cools. The technical name is starch retrogradation, meaning starch molecules start to reorganize and firm. If the term sounds scientific, the idea is simple. The loaf is balancing two quiet changes at once. Moisture is settling into a more even place, while the crumb is also beginning the slow path toward firmness. Once cooling is tied to both softness and firmness, flour type becomes an even bigger deal, because different grains hold and release water differently inside the crumb. Whole grain breads often read denser because bran and germ change both structure and water balance, not because the loaf failed to rise. Bran particles interrupt the continuity of the dough matrix, and they also compete for water. That means less water is freely available to keep bubble walls stretchy during expansion, so the crumb tends to set with smaller cells. Whole grain flours often carry more enzymes and flavorful compounds, which can shift fermentation behavior and influence browning. So, two loaves with the same timing can still land at different textures. When the grain mix changes, the most reliable approach is to treat the crumb as feedback rather than a verdict. That feedback can be surprisingly specific. Bakers can often diagnose process issues by where the crumb is dense, where it is open, and how the holes are shaped. Dense zones near the bottom can suggest the loaf was compressed during shaping, or that it was underproofed and expanded unevenly once it hit the oven. A collapsed top can suggest the structure was pushed past its peak and could not hold its own height through baking. Long, stretched holes aligned in one direction often point to strong shaping tension and directional expansion. Random giant voids, especially near the top, point back to trapped pockets rather than overall fermentation strength. You do not have to diagnose perfectly. You only need to notice one clue at a time, because each loaf teaches the next one. If a crumb is tight, but the loaf tastes great and slices beautifully, that may be exactly what the bread was meant to be. If a crumb is open, but the holes are inconvenient, that is not failure either. It is simply information. Maybe the dough was handled very gently and shaped with minimal degassing. Maybe hydration was high enough that bubbles grew large quickly. Maybe the dough was strong, but not evenly tightened during shaping. Bread has many good outcomes. The slice is just telling you which path you took. Once crumb and crust are treated like a readable record, the next useful step is looking at wild fermentation in starters. Sourdough changes both flavor and structure in ways that show up clearly in the slice, and that is where the story continues. A sourdough starter is a living culture made from flour and water. It is kept stable by regular refreshment, and it works because wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria settle into a long-term partnership. The yeast produces carbon dioxide that leavens dough. The bacteria produce acids that shape flavor and influence how dough behaves. Both groups keep finding fuel because flour enzymes steadily convert some starch into simple sugars over time. With repeated feedings, the mix tends to favor organisms that handle predictable dilution and increasing acidity. That is why a starter becomes more consistent after a short run of regular care. Once it steadies, it starts to feel less like a mystery jar and more like a quiet kitchen rhythm. The tang in sourdough comes mainly from organic acids, especially lactic acid and acetic acid. The balance between them depends on conditions more than on any one secret ingredient. Lactic acid usually reads as mild and rounded, like a gentle yogurt-like tang. Acetic acid reads sharper and more vinegar-like. Two sourdough loaves can share the same flour and still taste different if their fermentation conditions differ. Cooler temperatures, longer time, and stiffer cultures often encourage a more acetic profile. Warmer temperatures and wetter cultures often lean more lactic. The exact result still varies by flour and schedule, but the pattern holds often enough to be useful. Those acids also tend to lower the dough's pH, which can slow some spoilage and mold. That is one reason sourdough can keep a bit longer than similar bread made quickly, and it connects to how you feed the culture to keep acidity in a useful range. A starter stays predictable when its refreshment rhythm supplies enough fresh flour and water to dilute old acids and provide steady fuel. The clearest way to describe that rhythm is with weight ratios. Many bakers refresh at 1:1:1 for starter, water, and flour when they want a shorter cycle. They use larger ratios like 1:2:2 or 1:5:5 when they want a longer window before the culture peaks. More fresh flour means more food and more buffering against acidity, so the starter tends to rise more gradually and stay balanced longer. If the numbers feel like too much, you can listen for the idea instead. Bigger feedings buy you time. Smaller feedings bring a quicker peak. A ripe starter usually shows reliable expansion after feeding. It becomes airy, bubbly, and slightly domed, and it often smells tangy and clean rather than harsh. Some starters smell lightly fruity. Some smell like fresh flour and yogurt. If a starter smells sharply solvent-like, it is often a sign it has gone too long without enough food and is asking for a more generous refreshment. The details vary, but the general cue is simple. A healthy starter rises, holds, and then slowly begins to settle as food runs low. Once the rhythm is steady, discard starts to make sense. Discarding part of a starter before refreshing is not random. It is population control and acidity control. It resets the ratio of fresh food to accumulated byproducts and keeps acidity from climbing without limit. If you kept every gram and only added a small amount of new flour each time, acids and alcohol would build quickly. The culture would drift toward an overly sour, underpowered state where yeast struggles and fermentation becomes erratic. Removing a portion makes the refreshment a true reset. The microbes are fed in a balanced way instead of being asked to work in their own waste products. Thinking of discard as dilution makes sourdough care feel less wasteful and more logical. This also helps explain why sourdough timelines often feel slower and steadier than packaged yeast schedules. Sourdough dough typically ferments more slowly than dough raised with commercial yeast. Wild yeast populations are usually less concentrated, and the acidic environment changes the pace of activity. The slower pace is a feature. It gives flour enzymes time to free up sugars that support browning later. It gives gluten time to relax and reorganize, so shaping can feel smoother without forcing the dough. Many sourdough bakes rely on bulk fermentation that runs for hours rather than minutes. And the best cue is often the dough's change in volume and airiness, not a fixed clock time. Once the schedule stretches out, dough strength becomes a central concern, and acidity is one reason the strength can shift. Acidity changes dough structure, and the practical takeaway is that moderate acidity can improve strength, while excessive acidity over a long fermentation can weaken it. At moderate levels, lower pH can tighten gluten and improve gas retention. That helps explain why some sourdoughs hold their shape well even at higher hydration and still open neatly in the oven. But if fermentation runs too long, acids and enzymes can begin breaking down proteins and starches. The dough may turn slack, sticky, and prone to spreading even if it still looks lively and bubbly. This is why sourdough rewards gentle control of time and temperature. You are not only building flavor, you are protecting structure. Because time and temperature matter, storage becomes part of the system. A starter can be kept warm for frequent baking or held cold to slow it down. Refrigeration is simply a brake on microbial activity, not a different method. At room temperature, many starters need refreshment every 12 to 24 hours, with shorter intervals in warm conditions. In the refrigerator, many home routines stretch that interval to about once a week, because cold slows metabolism. If your routine changes, the starter can change with it. You can treat warmth as active mode and refrigeration as rest mode and move between them depending on your week. Sometimes a starter develops a grayish liquid layer on top. This layer is often called hooch. It is usually a mix of separation and byproduct buildup, and it often signals a long gap between refreshments. Most of the time, it points to a hungry culture rather than a ruined one. You can stir it in for a sharper flavor, or pour it off for a milder profile. Then refresh the starter with enough fresh flour and water to bring it back into balance. The main message of hooch is simply, the starter is asking for food. A quiet detail that keeps sourdough behavior predictable is starter hydration. Starter hydration influences both tempo and flavor, because a stiffer starter and a looser starter create different conditions for microbes and for acid production. A stiff starter, sometimes around 50 to 60% hydration, behaves more like a firm paste. It tends to ferment more slowly, and many bakers associate it with a sharper edge and acidity over time because acids can concentrate in a denser mix. A liquid starter near 100% hydration behaves more like a thick batter. It ferments faster, and it often reads milder in perceived sourness, even when it is very active. You do not have to memorize percentages to use this. The feel tells you what you need to know. A paste moves slowly and concentrates. A batter moves quickly and spreads. Once hydration is treated as a dial, the next practical dial is how much starter you use in the dough. Using starter in bread is mostly about inoculation. In plain terms, inoculation is the percentage of your dough's flour that is already fermented in the starter. That percentage helps control speed, flavor, and scheduling. Many loaves fall somewhere around 10 to 30% pre-fermented flour, but the right range depends on temperature and timing. More starter generally ferments faster and can bring acidity sooner. Less starter ferments more slowly and can taste gentler. This also explains a common myth. Sourdough does not have to taste strongly sour. If you use a lower inoculation, ferment warmer, and keep the timeline shorter, you can get a very mild loaf that still has sourdough texture and the subtle keeping qualities people love. If you use more starter, ferment cooler, and stretch time longer, you tend to build a sharper profile. Neither approach is more authentic. They are simply different choices, and the starter will follow the choices you repeat. If the details ever feel like too much, you can return to the simplest rhythm. Feed the culture so it rises predictably. Choose temperature to fit your schedule. Choose hydration and inoculation to steer tempo and flavor. Then watch the dough for volume, airiness, and strength, because sourdough is best read by behavior, not by a strict clock. And once the loaf is baked, the next set of useful facts is about what happens afterward, because stalling and storage begin the moment the bread starts to cool. Stalling is mostly a change in starch structure, not simply bread drying out. As a loaf cools and sits, starch molecules gradually reorganize and the crumb firms. The technical name is starch retrogradation. If that term feels scientific, the feel is simple. The crumb slowly tightens as it rests. Moisture does move around during storage, but the key texture shift comes from starch setting into a more ordered form. That is why a loaf can feel stale while still seeming damp inside. Once you separate stalling from dryness, storage choices start to make more sense. because you are no longer fighting only air. You are also working with starch. Refrigeration usually makes many wheat breads seem stale faster, because the cool range of a typical fridge encourages that starch firming. A home refrigerator often sits around typical fridge temperatures in the high 30s to low 40s Fahrenheit, and at those temperatures, the crumb can firm noticeably overnight. Lean breads often show it most clearly. A baguette that felt light and springy in the evening can feel tougher by morning, even if it was wrapped. This is why the common advice, "Don't refrigerate bread," exists for everyday loaves. The catch is that refrigeration can slow mold growth, so storage becomes a trade. Do you want to slow mold, or do you want to slow stalling? Once you see that trade, freezing becomes the simple third option. Freezing is the most effective way to pause stalling. Very cold temperatures slow starch molecules from rearranging as quickly. In practice, bread frozen soon after it has fully cooled will often taste closer to fresh when thawed than bread kept at room temperature for the same number of days. Slices are especially convenient because they thaw quickly and can go straight to a toaster. Whole loaves take longer, and they often benefit from a brief reheat to restore the crust. If you want a simple rule, it is this: cool completely, then freeze while the loaf still feels new. That timing matters because bread texture changes fastest early on. Many loaves stale most noticeably in the first day after baking. Then the rate of change tends to feel slower. The biggest shift happens as the crumb moves from just set to fully settled. The crust changes quickly during this window too. A crusty loaf often softens as interior moisture migrates outward, especially in lean breads where a crisp crust is a main feature. This is why fresh today and tomorrow morning can feel like two different breads, even when the loaf was baked well and stored carefully. Once that early window passes, recipe becomes the next big factor, because ingredients can slow or speed the firming process. Fat slows stalling in many breads because it interferes with starch reorganization and keeps the crumb more flexible. This is one reason enriched breads, like milk bread, brioche, and many sandwich loaves, stay soft longer than lean breads made with only flour, water, salt, and yeast. Sugar can help as well by holding on to moisture, and emulsifiers can help by keeping fats and water distributed more evenly through the crumb. This is why packaged sandwich bread often remains pliable longer than a bakery hearth loaf. The softness is not only about moisture, it is also about how starch behaves in the presence of fats and other ingredients. Once you see that, reheating becomes easier to understand too, because heat can change how starch feels for a little while. Reheating stale bread can temporarily reverse the firming effect. Warming can loosen the reorganized starch structure, so the crumb feels softer again for a short time. A quick oven reheat or toasting can bring back tenderness and aroma, but the effect fades as the bread cools, because retrogradation resumes when the loaf returns to room temperature. This is why reheating is more of a reset than a cure. It makes yesterday's bread feel lively again, but it does not rewind time permanently. For lean loaves, reheating can also revive the crust. A brief hot oven or toaster drives off surface moisture and can re-crisp the outside, which makes the bread feel fresher overall, even if the crumb is not truly new. This is one reason day-old bread can be excellent for toast and croutons. It is also why many people reheat a whole loaf briefly, then let it cool just enough to slice cleanly. Heat restores aroma, and it can give the crust a second crisp moment, even if the loaf will begin to firm again later. Paper versus plastic is a texture trade. Paper lets moisture escape. Plastic holds moisture in. Paper bags tend to protect crust crispness by allowing the surface to stay drier, but the crumb can firm faster, especially after the cut face is exposed. Plastic bags keep the crumbs softer by trapping humidity, but the crust often turns leathery or soft because moisture condenses and is reabsorbed at the surface. Many people split the difference without thinking of it as a rule. They use paper for a crusty loaf they plan to eat the same day. They use plastic for soft sandwich bread, where a tender crust is part of the style. The right choice depends on what you want to feel when you bite: crackle or softness. Once the container choice is set, the cut surface becomes the next variable that determines how quickly texture changes. Slicing exposes a large, fresh surface area, so pre-sliced bread usually loses fresh-baked character faster than a whole loaf stored intact. A simple habit is storing a cut loaf with the cut face down on a board or inside a bag. This reduces airflow across the exposed crumb and slows drying at that face. It also creates a small seal of its own, like a door closed gently rather than left open. For crusty loaves, keeping the bread whole until you need a slice often preserves a better balance between crust and crumb. The intact crust protects the interior. Each cut is a new opening, so fewer cuts means fewer chances for moisture to escape and for the crumb to firm too quickly. For sandwich loaves, the convenience of slicing tends to be worth the small texture cost, especially because those loaves are designed to stay soft anyway. Thin slices also feel stale sooner than thick slices because they have more surface area relative to their volume. The bread itself is not changing faster. Your bite is simply encountering more exposed area at once. If you want the most common planned staling method in American kitchens, it is toast. Toast is controlled drying plus browning, and it can make bread that is past peak freshness taste better than it did at room temperature. Heat drives off surface moisture, firms the outer layer, and triggers browning reactions that create new aroma compounds. Even plain bread can taste more complex when toasted. That is why stale bread uses work so well too. Breadcrumbs, stuffing, and bread pudding all depend on bread that absorbs liquid in a predictable way instead of turning instantly to paste. Drier bread drinks more evenly. It holds shape long enough to become something new. Commercial breads often stay soft longer because they include enzymes and emulsifiers that slow starch firming, but the home logic stays the same. Protect the crumb from excess airflow. Choose paper or plastic based on crust goals. Freeze when you want to pause time. Use heat when you want a quick texture reset before the next slice. If the science ever blurs, you can return to the simplest idea. Bread is always moving. Storage is just choosing the direction you want it to move next. Flatbreads exist in so many cuisines because they turn grain and water into a cooked staple without the timing and structure demands of a tall loaf. When dough is pressed or rolled thin, heat reaches the center quickly. It can cook on a griddle, a pan, a clay surface, or a hot stone in minutes. It does not require a deep oven chamber to set the middle. That short cook also means the bread can be made with whatever heat is already available, from a single burner skillet to a shared hearth. Fuel costs can stay low because the bread is done quickly. Styles like chapati, lavash, and tortillas differ in grain and technique, But the shared advantage is the same quiet rule. Thin cooks fast, and once that rule is clear, it becomes easier to see how specific grains produce specific flatbread styles. Tortillas show how bread can be built from different grains and still do the same work at the table, because corn tortillas and flour tortillas are not interchangeable even when both are thin rounds. Traditional corn tortillas begin with nixtamalization, an alkaline soak that softens dried corn and turns it into a dough called masa. In practice, that step changes flavor and improves binding, which is why masa can be pressed thin without crumbling apart. Nixtamalization is also widely described as improving the way corn supports human diets by changing how some nutrients are accessed. But the everyday takeaway is simple and useful. It turns hard corn into a cohesive dough that behaves predictably on a hot surface. Flour tortillas lean on wheat gluten for stretch instead. They often include a small amount of fat so they stay pliable. One easy way to remember the contrast is starch-set corn versus gluten flex flour. Corn tortillas tend to feel tender but less stretchy, while flour tortillas fold and roll more easily and reheat with a softer bend. Not all bread is baked in dry heat. Steamed breads set in moist heat, and that one change explains why they are tender and pale instead of crusty and browned. Breads like mantu and many filled buns cook inside a cloud of steam. The temperature at the surface is limited by boiling water, so the exterior never gets hot enough for strong browning reactions. The surface stays soft even when the inside is fully cooked through. These breads can still rely on fermentation for lift, but steam keeps the outer layer from drying early. That gives the dough more time to expand and set into a fine, even crumb without forming a firm shell. If baked bread feels defined by crust, steamed bread feels defined by softness. Grain choice can shift bread just as strongly as cooking method. Rye breads became staples in parts of Northern and Eastern Europe, in part because rye grows reliably in colder climates and poorer soils where wheat can be less dependable. Bread tends to follow the grains that thrive in local fields. Rye flour does not form an elastic gluten network like wheat. Instead, high rye loaves depend more on starch setting and careful hydration. The result is often a dense, moist crumb, meant to be sliced thin rather than torn into big chunks. Many rye breads are baked in pans for support. They are also often cooled fully before slicing, because rye crumb can seem gummy if cut while it is still warm and settling. The practical thread is that different grains do not just change flavor. They can change the whole way bread is served and eaten. Some breads are not kneaded doughs at all, but fermented batters. Injera, the Ethiopian flatbread, is a clear example. It is often made from teff, a tiny grain that is commonly milled into flour and mixed into a batter rather than a kneadable dough. The batter is left to ferment, often for multiple days. During that time, microbes produce acids and gas, and that activity becomes the pattern of small bubbles that later set into the bread's characteristic holes. Injera cooks in a thin layer on a hot surface, so it stays relatively flat, but the fermented bubbles give it a sponge-like structure. That sponginess is functional. It holds sauces and juices instead of letting them slide off. Injera is proof that bread can look nothing like a loaf and still rely on the same basic logic of fermentation, structure, and heat. Shape can be an everyday engineering decision too. The baguette is a useful example because a long, slender loaf proofs and bakes faster than a large round loaf made from the same dough. The narrow form increases crust to crumb ratio, so more of each bite carries browned flavor. The higher surface area also helps explain why baguettes tend to stale quickly compared with larger loaves. Many accounts connect the baguette's modern popularity to urban routines that favored frequent fresh baking and to early 20th century shifts in bakery work schedules. Though sources describe the details differently, and the style evolved over time rather than appearing in a single moment. You do not need a perfect origin story to feel the practical point. A long loaf fits a rhythm. It rises, bakes, and sells quickly, then gets eaten while it is still crisp and warm. Other breads aim for softness and moisture retention on purpose, and they do it by controlling water inside the crumb. Japanese milk bread is known for a very soft, shreddable interior. A key method behind that texture is tangjong, a cooked flour paste mixed into the main dough. To make it, a small portion of flour and liquid is heated until it thickens. That brief cooking gelatinizes some starch ahead of time, which helps it hold more water without making the final dough feel overly wet. Many recipes use roughly 1 part flour to about 5 parts liquid for this paste, and only a small fraction of the total flour goes into it, but the effect can be noticeable. The finished loaf stays tender, and it often stays that way longer. Tangjong is a clear example of a quiet lever. Set some starch early, and you can keep more moisture inside the crumb later. Some breads treat the surface before baking instead, changing how the crust develops. Pretzels are the classic example. They get their distinctive deep brown color and characteristic flavor from an alkaline dip before baking. Traditional pretzels use food-grade lye, an alkaline solution that strongly raises surface pH. Many home versions use baking soda in hot water as a gentler substitute. Either way, the higher pH speeds, browning, and shifts crust aroma compared with plain dough. The dip also gelatinizes surface starch, helping form a smooth skin that bakes into a firm, glossy crust. It helps coarse salt adhere too, so the salt stays in place instead of falling away. Once you remember that pH affects browning speed, it becomes easier to understand why two doughs baked at the same temperature can still brown very differently. If all these examples start to blur together, you can return to a simple backbone. Most breads still depend on the same transformation. Grain becomes flour. Flour meets water. Structure is built through mixing or time, and heat sets the inside while drying and browning the outside. The diversity comes from a small set of controllable levers. Which grain is milled? How much water is used? How long fermentation runs? And whether heat arrives as dry baking, direct contact on a hot surface, or moist steaming. If you keep track of those levers in simple terms, flour type, hydration feel, fermentation time, and cooking method, you can usually trace any loaf's texture back to a few concrete choices rather than a mystery. That is how breads across the world can look wildly different and still share the same quiet foundation. Good night, and may your thoughts settle as softly as warm bread cooling on the counter.